Thank you very much for your kind remarks. Can I be heard all the way back?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your kind remarks. It's a pleasure to be at the University of Hong Kong. This is not the first time I'm here, but I certainly would enjoy being here, and I thank you for the invitation. I first got interested in universities in writing my dissertation, and as you get older, you forget almost everything, but you never forget your dissertation. And there was a little section there on the medieval university, and you'll see why that became something of interest to me. And then this interest was sparked anew in 2001 when I was teaching at Stanford in Oxford. And my first impression was, wow, these are two really different universities. But you know, there is a thing called the Said Business School, hidden by the train station, but there is a business school at Oxford. And I began to realize that there were some changes that were taking place at Oxford. So instead of solely thinking about the differences, I began to think about the growing commonalities. And part of the argument I'm making is that any one university is on the one hand a function of its historical roots, and on the other hand caught, some would say trapped, by the globalization of the university, by global frames of reference. And the core sort of imagery is that if we looked at universities in 1900, they would look more different than they do today. Partly because I'm arguing globalization in general has generated global frames of reference which push universities in somewhat common directions. So that's kind of the overall image. Part and parcel of what it means to be an American university is that you're forever looking at other universities and rating. Some would call it poaching. This coming year, we have 6 assistant professors that we've taken from other universities and 2 full professors. But I want to remind you that the first official faculty raid that I'm aware of took place a very long time ago. It took place in 1229. And this was an attempt to raid not one faculty, but a whole university. This is the King of England urging the University of Paris to resettle in England. Of course, to say that there was an English king and a French nation at that time is misleading. Communication was in Latin. In many ways, the medieval university was more cosmopolitan than the 18th and 19th century university. The medieval university did not have to cope with nation states and national agendas. I'm trying to suggest that over time, the university becomes more national and then shifts again to becoming a more cosmopolitan institution. By way of contrast, here's a letter from the future University of Chicago president to the then president, and what is he complaining about? He's complaining about the fact that a German has been hired to head one of the departments, the Department of English, I believe, the Department of Literature, and he says, I must confess, I don't fancy having to work for a German. Less than 100 years later, the same university had Gerhard Casper as first the Dean of the College of Law, and then the provost. Subsequently, Casper came to Stanford to become the president of the university. No one particularly cared. Okay? The chair in sociology at Cambridge, who passed away recently, was a German also. Okay, so the strength of nationalities has weakened over time. The age of nationalism in some ways is being challenged by globalization. The core argument I want to make is that universities are changing. And again, I urge you to keep in mind that I am not here trying to sell you something. I'm not here advocating, nor am I here critiquing. I'm presenting what I think is happening, and I'm presenting an argument as to why I think what is happening is happening. You may like it, you may dislike it. I will in fact refer to both advocates and critics. But the argument I want to make is that universities are changing from historically rooted national institutions, reflected in the statement, I do not want to work for a German, to organizational actors that are supposed to be more accessible, more entrepreneurial, and more professionalized. And in keeping with the theme, I owe the phrase organizational actors to my German colleague, Jörg Krucken, who basically coined the phrase to say, look, increasingly universities are expected to have goals, to have plans to attain those goals. They're looking more and more like actors, not simply institutions. the loose assemblies of masters and scholars have given way to a much more organizational backbone, if you will. And I'll make some references to that as we go along. So I'm going to show you through some slides what I have in mind when I talk about the university becoming more accessible, more entrepreneurial, more professionalized. This partly reflects my research interests, and it partly reflects the fact that for the last 5 years, I have functioned, some would say malfunctioned, as Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs. And if you want to know what that is, I'm willing to answer that in the Q&A. I want to argue that these changes in many ways reflects the degree to which universities are influenced by an idealized model university. And this is being dramatized by world-class metaphors and transnational rankings, a point that has been alluded to by your dean. It's disseminated by consultants, and I'll have some materials on both of these points. And lastly, it's portrayed as portable practices. That's very important. If you portray these things as unique to a particular country, they will be rather readily rejected. They will be seen as an affront to national sovereignty, an affront to national historical legacies. But many of these things are pitched forward as portable practices. So keep that in mind, if you will. So the first thing I want to show you is something that I think you all know. This is looking at the expansion of universities and post-secondary enrollments from 1810 to 2010. So it's about 200 years. And what I want to highlight to you is that more universities were created after World War II than in the history of humankind up to World War II. The explosion of the university is a post-World War II phenomenon. The explosion of post-secondary enrollments is, as you can see, is also very much happening after World War II. Now, the initial reaction to this often was negative. In my dissertation, which I have not forgotten, I quote Edward Shields, who in 1971, writing for Minerva, said, "Isn't it amazing that at the time the Catholic Church is giving up on the sense of no salvation outside the church," he said it in Latin, which always makes it sound more profound, Americans act as if there's no salvation outside higher education. Well, one could argue that the world today acts as if there's no salvation outside higher education. A list of titles that you may remember: The Diploma Disease by Ronald Dorr, The Credential Society by Randall Collins, The Overeducated American, who would have thought that phrase? The Overeducated American by the economist Freeman. All of those ideas have, for better or for worse, they've been outcompeted. And perhaps the most interesting change is the change in the World Bank. The World Bank argued against the expansion of higher education. The World Bank was concerned about the expansion of higher education. The World Bank, which is supposed to be a bastion of free enterprise, was actually deep into central planning. They actually did think that if you had so many secondary enrollments, you should only have so much tertiary enrollments. Okay? All of that has changed. The World Bank now is deep into the knowledge economy or the knowledge society. There's no such thing as too much higher education. And driving this process is the growth of women in higher education. So that's the big story. Okay? Women's share of higher education has expanded enormously during this period of time. In some countries, it has overtaken the male share of higher education. Again, not something that was anticipated, not something that was expected. In the late 19th century, there were questions about whether women belonged. These were questions raised in Germany. These were questions raised in England. And the Ivy League stuck to an all-male institutions until well into the 1960s. Okay? So this is the big news. Universities have expanded. Now, in some ways, the idealized university, I want to argue, is the socially embedded university. And in their famous essay, which only I have read, Ben David and Zlagzauer in 1962, writing in the European Journal of Sociology, distinguished between the English, the German, the French, and the American systems. I want to highlight one and only one aspect, which is his argument that the European systems were much more buffered from society. Now, you can say that in a way that makes it sound elegant. You can say that in a way that sounds disturbing. But his point was that the status of civil servants and the authority that senior faculty had in these universities buffered them from a variety of interest groups which we now call constituencies or stakeholders. I'll come back to that point. Whereas the American university, I argued, was deeply embedded in its society. It was involved with various kinds of interest groups. I would argue that its boundaries between the university and society were often more porous, were often more permeable than in their European counterparts, and that very early on, American universities were hustling. I like the term hustling, coined by my colleague David Labrie, because it kind of captures the American spirit. Okay? And it's just a vulgar term, hustling. Okay? But that's the term that's used to explain how American universities proceeded in the 19th and 20th century. Notice that in 1906, Harvard President Eliot is already imagining a world in which the American universities will be competing not only with each other, but with foreign universities. In 1906, you used the word foreign. Now it's unacceptable. We all use the word international. Okay? 1906 is a different world. What is his answer to this? Is basically saying the university that raises more money is the university that's going to be number one. 1906, Harvard would not have been in any top 20 university list. No American university would have. It would have been dominated by German universities, Oxford and Cambridge, and maybe the University of Paris. Okay? But no American university would have. Okay? This is 1906. But think about what he's arguing. It's the essence of the hustling university. And what do we want? We want free money. What is free money? Free money is money that is not targeted to any specific enterprise. And anyone in development will tell you that's what they're looking for, free money. Buildings are beautiful, but they have to be maintained. So the ideal gift is a non-restricted gift. Okay? So this has been going on in the United States. And in 1906, incidentally, Harvard was not the best endowed university. So this is not the advantage of first mover. Harvard was not the best endowed university in 1906. Okay? This guy figured out a strategy now imitated by a bunch of universities to try to raise funding to be able to thrive in a competitive environment. My point is that this is no longer just uniquely American. And I believe the correct title is Pro Vice Chancellor instead of Vice Provost, so I apologize for Americanizing the title. Okay? But you have here the notion of institutional advancement thus as a liberating function, very much like Eliot. It moves academics out of the box fixed by government allocation. It puts the core values back to academic endeavors. I'm going to move fast. It allows dreams to be realized, and it encourages bold explorations and risk-taking, which are so precious for academic endeavor, and breakthroughs yet are hardly supported by public funding. The distinction between public and private, which is so sacred, or was so sacred in a number of European universities, was always a weak distinction in the United States. Public and private universities have competed for public and private monies. The University of California at Berkeley had the multinational pharmaceutical Novartis help build its Department of Molecular and Science and Cell Biology. Private multinational monies flowing into a public university. Earth Sciences at Stanford has been aided by Exxon. Earth Sciences at Berkeley has been aided by BP. I'm sorry, they made the wrong choice, okay? This accidents went BP way, so it's kind of embarrassing for them. But what I want to emphasize is the public and private university distinction is weak in the United States. Both are hustling for public and private monies, not block grants. Public monies are competitive grants. Okay? So not only are they competing to raid each other's faculty, they're competing for the same kinds of funding. And all of this takes place because you have a system which is politically decentralized and educationally decentralized. Okay? And that's straight out of Randall Collins's work. Political decentralization leads to educational decentralization, leads to competition. If you want your salary significantly raised at Stanford, get yourself a Harvard offer. So having emphasized that, I want to move on to what I call the professionalization of the university. And I think there are aspects to that. One is the concern with organization and the concern with management. This is a much earlier American concern. And my argument is, well, yes, your boundaries are porous. You have to represent the university to a variety of constituencies. You cannot count on block funding. So you're perennially worried about your organization, you're perennially management, long before the term management of reputation, we now have that as a term. Long before that gets formalized, American universities are involved in professionalizing. Again, professionalizing doesn't necessarily mean good. It just means you create an organization that goes beyond the core mission of the university, teaching and research. So what I had here in a paper with Diana Tiplik was looking at European journals and making the case that over time, these journals increasingly emphasize management. I think the one we have here uses the Social Science Citation Index. We have another table that just looks at 6 European journals. And my point is that increasingly, they're talking management. They're talking organization. Now, the talk may be quite negative, okay? My good colleague Tom Christensen always says, in the good old days, and I said, Tom, those were really good old days if you were a senior professor. I think if you were struggling, what we now call a junior professor, inside the habilitation cage of your grand master, maybe they were not such good days, okay? But this is what I want to emphasize. On the one hand, more emphasis on management. I want to use as a small example the change in the organizational flowchart in one school of education, that school I know best, between 1986 and the present. This is what the School of Education looked like in 1986 when Jerry visited it, coincidentally. You have a dean, you have a secretary. The category secretary no longer exists. Everybody's professionalized. Secretaries have college degrees. They're not simply the spouses of faculty, and so they have other titles. And we had at that time 2 associate deans, one for academic affairs and one for administration. We now have 4 associate deans. We had no assistant deans. We now have 3 assistant deans. And we had this little thing here called development officer. We will now have an associate dean for external affairs. That's the development office. And you will see a lot more boxes underneath the associate dean for external affairs. We had something called a computer manager, and below it we had a couple of grad students, not anymore. We now have an assistant dean for technology who also has the title CTO, Chief Technology Officer. How corporate can you get? We fast forward to today. Okay, I know you cannot read the words, and I understand that. But your first impression is, oh my, there's a lot more boxes. Okay? And indeed there are more boxes. Some are repetitive, but I just want to highlight the point. We went from 2 to 4 associate deans. Now, part of it was the dean began to realize, I'm increasingly going to be involved in fundraising. It's not just the president of the university that tries to raise funds. Every unit within the university is trying to raise funds, which is why every unit often has a development officer. Of course, you have to coordinate with the central development officer. But aware of that, the associate dean for academics affairs was split into associate dean for faculty affairs and associate dean for student affairs. Basically, if the dean was going to be out of town, the associate dean for faculty affairs faced the firing squad. That would be my colleagues, okay, whom I'm eager to rejoin. So again, there's some reason why these things happen, okay? But the net effect is much more organization than in 1986. And as we go along, I'll point out this is not just bureaucracy, because there are all kinds of professional development plans going on. Many of these people are going to seminars to, quote, learn to be leaders. Every associate dean not only has a college degree, but has a master's degree. Our associate dean for finance and administration has an MBA from Berkeley. Our associate dean for external affairs has an MA in religious studies. And as I always tell her, We look forward to the grace of God. So again, that's kind of important. These are highly educated people, and they think of themselves as professional, and the university provides opportunities for their professional development. That was different in 1986, and it was certainly different in other universities where there was a very loose organizational backbone. You can read Christine Mousseline, who makes explicit the case that the French university system did not have organizational backbone. It was loose, association of masters and students, but you didn't have that sense of organization. We pointed out that some of these properties of the university, the more accessible university, the university that was more linked to organizations, more professionalized, that all of these, one way in which this gets communicated is by the rise of world class. Okay, so we have books, we have conferences on how to be a world-class university. I'm not going to be telling you how to be a world-class university. I don't know what it's like to be a world-class university. I have misgivings about the term. But the point is that's gone up. And it's pretty new. Okay? I mean, you know, you look at what it looked like in 2000. And it's really gone up. And I'll show you some slides to show there are implications to the rise of this idea. There are implications, and one of the implications is you begin to think in terms of multiple dimensions. So you can be a world-class university with respect to teaching, with respect to sustainability, green university, so it allows for, and of course in the American case, it allows for any and every university to have world-class aspirations. As some of you may know, every American is above average. It's mathematically impossible, okay? But every American proceeds as if when I say that to the class, I sometimes get nods, and then they go, remember, these are people who are developing apps, okay? These are people who are going to be very successful. But initially, the idea of everybody's above average is such an American flavor to it, okay? It takes them a while to realize, no. So we have the spread of the idea of the world-class university. And not surprisingly, it leads to national excellence initiatives related to world-class higher education. And I just have a sprinkling here. This is not representative. There are many different kinds of universities. They do it in Germany, and the Humboldt doesn't make it the first time around, and everybody thinks it's a major crisis. And a couple of technical and scientific universities make it, and just as the rankings themselves have a tilt towards science and technology, a number of these national excellence initiatives also have that kind of tilt. It's simply to illustrate that it's not just that the term is being used. Many a different country implements something that relates to world-class higher education. And my point was to show that it cuts across a whole bunch of countries. Okay? When you look at Singapore, ask yourself, did Singapore have a world-class university when it became an Asian tiger? And if it didn't, do you need a world-class university to be an Asian tiger? Think about it. Come back to that point. I think if you had looked at higher education in the 50s, it was not primarily thought of as an engine of economic development. It was thought of as many different things. Training leaders in a diffuse way, places for kids of a particular kind of background. But the idea of connecting it rather directly to economic development, engines of economic progress, if you will, that's a fairly new idea. And as I said, it used to not be an acceptable idea. Now, I can tell you that I've done research which shows that, in fact, high levels of science and engineering enrollments are associated with economic growth. I can also tell you that the association is weaker for less developed countries. I can further tell you that the belief in this is stronger than the evidence supporting it. I'm not arguing there's no evidence, okay? But I am arguing that belief is really widespread. And what's not clear is whether you need 100 good universities or whether you should invest in 10 world-class universities. Do you want 10 strong Midwestern universities, or do you want one Harvard? to put it starkly. It's not clear to me that there's a clear-cut empirical answer to that. It's clear to me that many universities are very much in the global reference, are very much using global referential standards. And in a moment, I'll show you something from my own university. And by that, I don't mean Stanford. I mean the university where I got my first degree. But again, this is now very strongly believed. There was a lot of skepticism about this earlier. The transnational rankings from Shanghai all the way down to QS. Okay. So there are many different kinds of rankings. Some of them include student input. How much do you like your university? How friendly is it? So again, my point is that you can get multiple dimensions, and some universities can be winners in some, and some universities can be winners in others. Okay. But there's been a proliferation of rankings. Has anybody here been asked to rank universities? I'm sure Mark has. I have, and I've been very hesitant. I mean, I'm being asked to rank departments of sociology throughout Europe, I know some, but I really don't have the kind of expertise, and I suspect most people don't. So I worry about the process that generates the numbers that end up with rankings, okay? I understand the top 20, but the idea that number 1 is radically different from number 10 is unclear to me. Okay? At one point, the Graduate School of Education was ranked number 1, and I told my dean, as you know, I believe that these rankings are valid, reliable, and profound. And she said, no, the problem with playing that card is when the rankings change next year, they'll tell you, well, gee, what happened? How come you slipped from number 1 to number 3? And you'll have to say, these rankings are pretty slippery. So much for valid, reliable, and profound. I grew up in the Philippines. I went from kindergarten through university at De La Salle, which is a Christian Brothers operation, all-boys school. If going to an all-boys school utterly messes you up, you are looking at one totally messed up person. Needless to say, I did not want my son to go to an all-boys school. Okay? This is a letter they sent to the alumni in 2007. Okay? Now, it used to be that they send you letters where they took you down memory lane, right? Pictures of buildings. Maybe they could even stick a picture of yourself in shorts running around in a soccer field, okay? They do send those letters. But this one here is basically very much attuned to the Times Higher Education Supplement. 392nd out of top 500 universities in the world. You can then go regional, 89th in the Asia-Pacific region. By the way, is anybody here from the University of Bremen? Because they're 393rd, okay? I just want you to know, we beat the heck out of the University of Bremen. We're one step ahead of them. Okay? And then, of course, a little aside here, the top-rated private university with a little reference to the competitor. Okay, my point is, this is the Philippines. This is not a university you've probably heard of. And they're still very much involved in this particular referential set. And it's very professional. They tell you, of course, these rankings are biased in favor of publication in the English language. Okay, hence the problem of French universities. Of course, they're biased in favor of science and technology. So it's not as if they're naive. They do know some of the shortcomings, okay? But they also know that this is something that they should be able to say. We're one of the top 500 universities in the world. This is a world in which there are rankings, but there are also consultants that communicate rankings and organize conferences and workshops to provide leadership for the world-class university. And this comes directly from an email I got from the world's #1 multinational consulting firm. Starts with an M. Some of you are smiling because you know where I'm going. It is McKinsey. Okay. Now, I want you to take a look at this. I have no expertise in the Kingdom of Bahrain. I have no expertise in that region of the world. In fact, much of my research is not that contextualized to start with. So why are they asking me to do this? Now, I'm not silly enough to pretend that I'm the only one who got this email. I suspect about 100 people got this email, okay? But look at the wording of the email, because it is very interesting. What major trends are occurring? So they're interested in major trends in education, especially higher education. Well, you know, that's right up my alley. I can send them a paper where I describe major trends. I have no problems with that. What are the factors that make an educational system most successful, particularly in a small developing nation? Again, it's nuanced. Small developing nation. They could have said small authoritarian developing nation. And I thought that, and therefore I mentioned Singapore, which would no longer be developing now, but was certainly developing back in the 70s and 80s. Okay? And then my favorite sort of emphasis is, from whom can Bahrain learn? There's an emphasis here that a country can be learning from other countries. It's rather explicit. They're looking at what are the major trends occurring. They're in the process of doing educational reforms. And they're asking, from whom can Bahrain learn? If you lived in a world in which universities were solely imagined as historically grounded, there would be no sense of asking a foreigner what his views were on what were successful education reforms. There would be no sense in asking, well, which country has done well, because you could say there are 1,000 different paths to success, so why should we? Notice they're not saying it must fit with our culture, it must fit with our religion. This is completely decontextualized. Okay? This is the world of consultants. And again, a very long time ago, the World Bank could get together people and say, here's the game we're playing. Would you give these country the monies they're asking for? And here's the information. And they would not tell you which country. Here's the information. They give you some characteristics of their educational system. And it's at that point that I realized that they really had a formula. Do not give monies for higher ed unless they have sufficiently developed secondary schooling. They don't have that formula anymore. Okay? So keep this in mind. And my guess is that, seriously, almost everyone in this room could have given the answers I gave, which is to tell you, you can be a consultant. So this should be some kind of inspiring. Meaning, you know, if you can't get a job in academia, you can be a consultant. And if you play your cards right, you'll probably earn a lot more than your professor. It's supposed to be inspiring. Okay? Smile. Okay? Now I got you to smile. So the idea is that we live in a world where we think in terms of portable practices, certainly portable policies. And I'm giving you just 4 examples of what one could think of as portable practices. There are others. Teaching, getting and administering research grants, managing departments and other units, and diversifying. We could have put sexual harassment there too. My Korean colleagues are asking me for guidelines for sexual harassment, because sexual harassment has been discovered in Korea. Okay? And believe me, I have guidelines. Okay? If you want guidelines for any of those things, Stanford is just oozing with guidelines. Okay? So I'm going to show you a few things to illustrate the sense of best practices. Engage faculty in building an institutional culture of effective student learning assessment. Okay? And what I want to call to your attention is, on the one hand, they say, develop your own strategy. So you can be distinctive. That's the second sentence. But they are convinced that you need to create a culture of improvement-oriented assessment. And for that, you need to engage faculty. And the last thing faculty really want to be engaged in is to figure out this last wave of assessment reforms. In my institution, we have come up with a new, improved, and customizable faculty assessments. Fortunately, I'm on sabbatical, so someone will learn this before I come back, and with some luck, we may be on to an even newer and even more improved system by the time I come back. Okay? Because if you've been around for a while, you realize how many of these reforms come back. Okay, so it's not linear, it's back and forth. But here again, you could go to Cambridge, this would be Cambridge, Massachusetts, and learn about building an institutional culture of effective student learning assessments. It doesn't say you have to be American. It doesn't say you have to be Christian. It doesn't, this supposedly is going to be helping everyone. And you will find people from various kinds of countries coming here. Again, when this gets implemented in a different country, of course it's going to interact with local historical roots. Of course you're going to have what the Swedes call, the Scandinavian institutionalists call translation. Okay? But the point is, something is being translated. There is some master script that's being translated. Okay? That's what my work tries to emphasize. Here we have fundraising for deans. Has fundraising been added to your official responsibilities? Guess what? If you're a dean, it has been added. This was not the case back in the 80s. Deans would show up, they'd smoke pipes, they were broadly read, and that was their main virtue, that they could understand different lines of research, and they valued what their colleagues were doing. They can do all of that now, but they also are very often expected to fundraise, and if you're expected to fundraise, you can always go to this particular fundraising conference. Again, a lot of this came earlier in American universities. Today, we of course know what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to meet with consultants. They will ask you what your core values are. And you cannot simply say, like Don Quixote, sé quién soy. I know who I am, I don't have to spell it out. No. You have to spell out your core values, which will then inform your vision, which will then inform your mission, which will then inform your, I'm forgetting what the magic word is, the strategy. Help me out. Yeah. Come on, you're an associate, and you're supposed to do. But by now, it's fairly scripted, okay? And I don't speak of something alien. We have consultants because we're trying to create a new building. We want a new building, and it's not enough to say we want a new building. And we cannot say we want a new building because every professional school at Stanford has got a new building. That would not work. So we have to have clarification of our values and so on. And I've been to those meetings. I've paid my dues. We moved to Toronto, so this doesn't look like it's completely USA. And here again, it's advanced leadership development in higher education, strategies for engagement and inclusion. I should point out, which I didn't, I'm sorry, but I should point out that 3/4 of American universities have development offices. 3/4 of the universities in the Carnegie classification have development offices. Okay? Some of them morphed out of alumni association. Some were built completely separate from, but increasingly there's a sense that you have to integrate the alumni association with the development office. Okay? My associate dean for external affairs is really a development officer, and she's married to a development officer in central administration. Keep it in the family. Okay? And he's Chinese American, which is really great. You can sort of think through why that's great. Okay? So we have development offices, and we also have diversity offices. So increasingly, universities either have a vice provost for diversity or somebody who's designated to deal with diversity. Sometimes it's connected to internationalization. As I said, the word foreign is not there, it's international. And if you look at, for example, Amherst College, in an older description in its website, it doesn't make references to international students. In a more recent one, it includes it under the title diversity. So many a college and university in the United States proudly informs everybody else, as do many other universities in the world, we value diversity, and that in the American context, that often means ethnic/race, but it also means people from other countries in the world. And sometimes we list how many different countries are represented in this particular university. And that's thought of as an asset, meaning it'll make it more attractive to others. You could imagine a time when it would not have been attractive. There are all these foreigners. Why would I want to send my children to this place? Okay. Because now it's thought of as cosmopolitan and desirable and so forth. Not only are specific universities engaged in creating development offices, engaged in creating diversity offices, but there also has arisen in the United States a Council for Advancement and Support of Education. Institutional advancement is one way of thinking about the professionalization of fundraising. Okay? And I want to emphasize it's very professionally done. The council here starts in the United States, spreads to Europe, and now it has 3,000 member universities in 77 countries. It has regional offices in Europe, Asia, and Latin America, and its goal is to teach universities how to professionalize fundraising. So I remember the day when fundraising was simply, you got calls from either students in the university. Sometimes there was an external consultant, but universities did not have inside the university a development office. Okay? They do now. I still get a call from some 18-year-old who hopes I contribute, and I kind of point out, look, I became a lifetime member of the Alumni Association, thinking that that way I would never be disturbed again. But it turns out that's a mistake, because then your name is in the list, and you get disturbed annually. Okay? Then I have to plead the fact that, look, I teach here. You know, you should be talking to people who are captains of industry. You shouldn't be talking to. Okay? But in addition to that, there's very professionalized fundraising. And if you don't know how to do it, they will help you do it. And the reason I mentioned my associate dean and her husband is they've both gone to China to talk about professionalization of fundraising in Chinese universities, courtesy of the Council for Advancement and Support of Education. So again, think about how much confidence there is in this. They're not trying to hide this. They're not saying, oh, this American strategy, we don't want the rest of the world to know. No, this is like, it's a free good. Everybody should be doing this. And if you can go back to the Harvard president Eliot, he thought this was a free good too. He went to the Johns Hopkins University president and said, you know, you should be thinking about doing this. Couldn't be bothered with it. Okay? So again, this is imagined as a win-win-win for everybody. If everybody begins to move in this direction, the acquisition of free money. So, what I want to conclude with is that we can always go back and think in terms of the historical roots of the university. Oxford and Cambridge have a tutorial system. Harvard and Stanford don't. Harvard and Stanford historically have an enormous amount of flexibility in terms of what, quote, students will major in. The English continue to talk about what I read at Oxford or what I read at Cambridge. My nephew tells me that he's going to the university in Holland, and not my nephew, my grandnephew really, and he's, what are you going to study? I say, econometrics. Well, that's kind of specialized for a 17-year-old. Okay, but that's the European system. He's going to study econometrics. He'll spend a couple of years drinking, but he will study something called econometrics. Okay? The American system has 2 years where you pitter-patter, you take a lot of required courses, and that, incidentally, is now celebrated in a number of countries. The whole turn toward liberal studies, which is influencing a number of universities in Asia. We all know what the words are. Critical thinking, learning to learn. Okay? So, again, you can look at universities, look at their historical roots, and see how much does that influence them. But if I'm right, that over time, they begin to look more like each other, you have to draw one of two conclusions. Either you have to say, it's because it works, that's why. Okay? Of course they change. They change in the direction of what works. And I believe that's true when you can show the means-ends connection very clearly. My favorite example is the mousetrap. If Jerry and I have mousetraps, and his mousetrap is filled with dead mice, and mine shows that the cheese is missing, but there are no dead mice, you will buy his mousetrap, because it's clearly a more efficient mousetrap. But when we're dealing with broad goals, like learning to learn, being creative, the means ends is not that clear. And when the means ends is not that clear, when it's not evident that there's an efficacious technology to achieve the goals, then organizations, including universities, begin to look at what other universities do. And that influences what they do. So they're influenced by what other universities do, and they're also influenced by what consultants and experts talk about. So there's a theorized model of the university diffuses precisely because it's really difficult to figure out what constitutes an efficacious technology. There are features of the American system that do not diffuse. I don't hear anybody saying, you know, what you need to do is have an intercollegiate system. That's what you need to do. You know what Harvard and Yale are all about? It's about one game. It's called football. It's American football. It's played nowhere else. Okay? And when Harvard tied Yale in one famous game, the Crimson had the headlines, Harvard beats Yale 28-28. Okay? Because they came from behind. And every Harvard man knows that story. And every Yale man knows that story and hates it. Okay? So, that's, where I live, it's Stanford versus Cal. When we have visiting professors, I have to explain, what the heck are you guys doing? There's a funeral going on inside the campus. You go, no, it's the burial of Oski the bear. It's a tradition. The bear is buried 2 or 3 days. They don't really bury a bear, okay, before animal rights comes after me, okay? So there it is. But no one says that's what you need. No one would get anywhere in Asia by saying, you know what, those American universities really don't value service. They really do not value service. You don't get tenure because you provide the university with service. There's a very strong service ethos in Asian universities. Okay? So not every aspect of the American university diffuses, makes it into this theorized model of the university. Some do, and what I want to contend is that increasingly universities are attuned to what I call templates of excellence. And what do they emphasize? They emphasize accessibility. Very hard to now say we have too many people in higher education. We create different kinds of universities to cope with increased numbers. But it's really hard to say, you know what, some people don't belong in the university. That would just be bad. Social usefulness, and I put that social usefulness in quotation marks. You could argue that the older universities were useful because they were providing ministers, they're providing lawyers, they're providing leaders, okay? But they often were disengaged from the nitty-gritty of society. And increasingly, they are engaged with the nitty-gritty of society. And that's part of the model. And lastly, the whole excitement around professional management and organization, which is what that means is universities hire high-ranking officers who will deal with issues of management, whose full-time work will be to think through how do I garner resources, how do I manage them, such that over time we are financially stable. And more than that, we are able to do what we're supposed to do and not have to be concerned about monies. Okay? So, as universities globalize, the argument is they become organizational actors. So again, it's not that there are no differences between universities. You have to be very foolish to make that claim. The claim I make is that over time, the differences have been muted. And I make the further claim that this is not because we really know what makes a university work, but because there are models of what is, quote, the good university, and those models spread. Lastly, I want to point out that increasingly the legitimacy of the nation state hinges on its system of higher education. This would not have been the case in 1900, but increasingly having a system of higher education that's admired is an indicator of how legitimate you are as a nation state. And if I'm right about that, that is why issues about higher education are so central and so controversial globally. Thank you very much for your attention.